A 9-year-old girl vanishes on the day before her 10th birthday. 17 days later, police pull her out of a hand-built underground chamber, hidden behind a false wall, buried beneath a house on Long Island. The man who put her there wasn't a stranger. He was the one person she trusted more than anyone else in her life. This is the story of Katie Beers, a girl who survived a childhood most adults couldn't imagine, and who outsmarted her own captor to make it out alive. Katie Beers was born at the very end of December 1981 in Mastic Beach, a working-class town on the South Shore of Long Island, New York. From the beginning, her home life gave her almost nothing to hold on to. Her mother struggled to care for her, and by the time Katie was a toddler, she had effectively been handed off to her godmother, a woman named Linda Guillory, and Linda's husband, Sal. What should have been a safe arrangement turned into something far darker. Inside that household, Katie wasn't treated like a daughter. She was treated like unpaid help, responsible for cooking, cleaning, and looking after chores no child should have to manage. But the housework wasn't even the worst of it. According to Katie's own later accounts, Sal Guillory began sexually abusing her when she was as young as 2 years old, and the abuse continued for years. When she eventually worked up the courage to tell her godmother what Sal was doing to her, she wasn't believed. She was accused of lying and pushed away. For a 7-year-old girl, being disbelieved by the one adult she had left was its own kind of devastation. Katie wasn't sent to school. She grew up largely isolated from other children, cut off from the ordinary rhythms of a normal childhood. In that isolation, one relationship stood out to her as different from all the rest. A neighborhood man named John Esposito had become a fixture in her life. Locally, he was known as Big John, a nickname he picked up partly because of his size and partly because he'd cultivated a reputation as a friendly, trustworthy presence around local kids, someone involved with youth mentorship organizations in the area. To Katie, he wasn't just a family friend. He was the person she felt safest with, someone who took her places, who seemed to actually care how her day had gone. In a childhood defined by exploitation and neglect, John Esposito represented something rare: comfort. That misplaced trust would turn out to be the most dangerous relationship of her life. On December 28, 1992, 2 days before Katie's 10th birthday, John offered to take her to Spaceplex, an indoor recreation center in Long Island that she loved, the kind of place with go-karts, batting cages, and arcade games. It was meant to be an early birthday treat, just the two of them. Katie had no reason to think twice about going. She trusted him completely. But at some point that day, Katie disappeared. One moment she was there, and the next she was simply gone, swallowed up inside a building full of families and children, without a single witness able to say what had happened to her. Not long after, Katie's godmother Linda received a frantic, garbled phone call. A voice claiming to be Katie said a man had grabbed her, that he had a knife, that he was coming after her. Then the call cut off. Panic spread through the family almost instantly, and police were notified. By the time officers arrived at Spaceplex, John Esposito was already there, and he told them Katie had simply vanished while he wasn't looking. The recreation center was evacuated and searched from top to bottom. Nothing. No sign of the girl at all. Detective Dominic Verone, who headed the Long Island Police Department's kidnapping investigation, caught the case, and almost immediately, something about that phone call didn't sit right with him. Statistically, the overwhelming majority of child abductions are carried out by someone the child already knows, often a family member, not a stranger snatching a kid off the street. On top of that, the call itself fell off. Would a terrified 9-year-old really use a word like kidnapped? And more importantly, how would a child who had just escaped a knife-wielding abductor find her way to an unattended telephone to make a call at all? Verone couldn't ignore those questions, but he also couldn't afford to dismiss the possibility that a child really was out there in danger. Every hour mattered, so the investigation moved forward on 2 tracks at once. Treat it as a real abduction while quietly probing the inconsistencies. With no physical trace of Katie anywhere near Spaceplex, investigators sent the recording of that phone call to the FBI for forensic audio analysis, hoping it might reveal something about where she'd been calling from or confirm whether the voice was genuine. While they waited on results, Verone worked through the list of people closest to Katie. Because in kidnapping cases, the people who knew the victim best are almost always where the truth is hiding. That list included her biological mother, Marilyn, who had lost custody rights and clearly had complicated, painful feelings about her daughter's living situation. It included Linda, the godmother who had taken Katie in but failed to protect her. And it included Sal, Linda's husband, the man who had been formally accused of sexually abusing Katie and who, if the truth about him ever fully surfaced, had every reason in the world to want her silenced. Each of them, on the surface, had a motive that made sense. Then came word back from the FBI, and it changed the entire shape of the investigation. Audio analysis revealed that the panic call wasn't live at all. It was a recording, Katie's voice captured earlier and played back through a phone to make it sound like a real-time emergency call. Someone had staged it, deliberately building a story that pointed toward a stranger abduction that never actually happened at Spaceplex. Whoever was behind this hadn't kidnapped Katie in a moment of impulse. They had planned it, recorded her voice in advance, and engineered a scene designed to send investigators chasing a phantom. While detectives worked to unravel the deception, Katie was living through something almost impossible to picture. She had been taken to what could only be described as an underground bunker, hidden beneath the floor of a garage and accessible only through a narrow crawl space behind a false wall. Inside was a small chamber outfitted with a stained mattress and a homemade wooden box resembling a coffin, secured with locks and chains. Her captor made it brutally clear this was not a temporary hiding place. This was meant to be permanent. In the days that followed, Katie endured repeated sexual assaults at the hands of the man holding her, abuse that, out of respect for her and in keeping with responsible reporting on survivors, we won't detail further here. What made Katie's situation so remarkable wasn't just her survival. It was how relentlessly she worked, even as a child, to give herself a fighting chance. She noticed that the wooden enclosure she was locked inside had a weak point in its door, and over time, through sheer persistence, she managed to kick it loose enough to break free of it, at least temporarily, before realizing she was still sealed inside the larger underground room with no way out. While searching what little space she had for anything useful, she found a set of keys on a shelf and quietly hid them beneath her mattress, not entirely sure yet what they might open, but understanding instinctively that information and small advantages were the only tools she had. It would later turn out that key fit the padlock on the chain around her neck, giving her the ability to free herself whenever her captor wasn't around, and to rechain herself convincingly before he returned, buying herself small windows of relief without ever letting him know she'd found a way out. Back in the outside world, the case had taken on a life of its own. As detectives dug deeper into John Esposito's background, deeply troubling information surfaced. Years earlier, he had reportedly been connected to an abduction involving a young child, and he had been quietly turned away from a youth mentorship organization after a background check flagged concerns about him, despite the trusted, friendly image he projected to families in the community. That history reframed everything. The man who had spent years positioning himself as Katie's most reliable friend had a documented pattern that nobody around her had ever known about. Investigators began watching him closely, keeping him under near constant surveillance, searching his property and applying steady pressure, even without enough evidence yet to make an arrest. Inside the chamber, Katie was doing something extraordinary for a child her age. She kept access to a television, and through it, she was able to follow the investigation into her own disappearance in something close to real time. She watched her mother make a tearful public plea for her safe return. She watched Sal, the man who had abused her for years, appear on camera claiming to be desperate for her to come home, a moment that filled her with anger rather than comfort, given what she knew about him. And she absorbed every piece of news that suggested police were closing in on the truth about that staged phone call, which meant she understood, better than her captor likely realized, that the walls were closing in around him too. As the pressure mounted, Esposito grew increasingly unstable. At one point, he suggested to Katie that she stage photographs appearing to show her dead, hoping it might convince police to abandon the search and leave him alone. It was, in effect, an attempt to manipulate a 10-year-old into helping orchestrate what would have almost certainly been received as evidence of her murder. Katie understood on some level that faking her death could just as easily become the final chapter of her real one, and she refused. Instead, she took a different approach, one that speaks to just how sharp and resourceful she was under unimaginable stress. She began engaging him in long personal conversations, asking about the future, about school, about the ordinary life milestones a 10-year-old girl imagines for herself. When he responded with unsettling remarks suggesting a future together, she consistently pushed back, refusing to accept that version of reality, gently but persistently steering him instead toward reckoning with what he'd actually done and where it could possibly end. She stopped eating food he brought her, wary that it might be drugged to keep her compliant while he handled the outside world. She rarely allowed herself to fully sleep. Every choice she made was a calculated act of self-preservation. The combination of factors, unrelenting police scrutiny, Katie's persistent psychological pressure on him, and his own guilt, eventually broke Esposito down. He began telling Katie he was considering ending his own life or fleeing entirely, both outcomes that would have left her trapped and alone in that chamber with no one aware of where to find her. Recognizing the danger in that scenario, Katie deliberately told him she wasn't feeling well, adding one more layer of pressure at exactly the right moment. Between the constant police presence outside his home and Katie's own persistence, something in him finally cracked. He reached out to his attorney and made an admission that would end the 17-day search. He knew exactly where Katie was, because he was the one who had put her there. He told his lawyer she was hidden behind a wall. What followed stunned even seasoned investigators. Esposito walked detectives through a genuinely elaborate sequence to reach the hidden chamber. A bookshelf on wheels that had to be pulled aside, a section of vinyl flooring that peeled back to reveal a massive concrete slab, a pulley system stored in the garage that had to be rigged just to lift that slab out of the way, and finally a narrow crawl space leading down into the room where Katie had been held. It had clearly taken meticulous planning and no small amount of construction work, undertaken over a long period of time, all with the singular purpose of eventually imprisoning a child. In a detail that still unsettles people who know the case, Katie later realized she had unknowingly played in that very space while it was under construction, with no idea it was quietly being built as her future prison. When police finally broke through and reached her, Katie's reaction surprised almost everyone in the room. Rather than the traumatized, broken child they braced themselves for, she appeared composed, even upbeat, greeting her rescuers with a resilience that spoke volumes about the sheer strength it had taken her to survive those 17 days with her wits intact. John Esposito was arrested and ultimately convicted of first-degree kidnapping, receiving a sentence of 15 years to life in prison. The investigation into Katie's disappearance ended up exposing far more than just one man's crime. As the full picture of her home life came out, including the years of sexual abuse at the hands of Sal and Guillory and the neglect she'd suffered under Linda's roof, authorities moved to permanently remove her from that environment. Sal was separately prosecuted and convicted for the abuse he had inflicted on her over the years. Katie was placed into foster care, and for the first time in her life, she found something resembling real stability. Parents who looked out for her, siblings, a household that didn't require her to fend for herself. She has since described that placement as nothing short of a turning point, the beginning of an entirely different life than the one she'd been handed. What makes Katie Beer's story so widely remembered isn't only the horror of what happened to her. It's what she did afterward. Rather than let those 17 days or the years of abuse that came before them define the rest of her life, she built something entirely her own. She grew up, started a family, and eventually chose to speak publicly about her experience, writing a memoir and becoming an advocate who works alongside organizations dedicated to child safety and to finding missing and exploited children. She has said in various interviews over the years that survival and recovery aren't the same as forgetting, and that healing is possible even after the kind of childhood almost no one else could imagine surviving. Katie Beer's case remains one of the most chilling reminders that danger to children doesn't always come from a stranger in a van. Sometimes it comes from inside the household, and sometimes it wears the face of the person a child trusts the most. It's also, in its own way, a story about extraordinary resilience, a 10-year-old girl locked in a hidden chamber built specifically to contain her, who studied her captor, outlasted his patience, and ultimately talked her way into surviving what he had spent years planning. She didn't just get rescued. In the days before help arrived, she had already started saving herself.